Welcome to the Persecution Report. I'm Greg Musselman. Coming up, Christians in Uzbekistan continue to face hardship. Later, these women in Chiapas, Mexico have been separated from their husbands for over a dozen years.
It's discouraging when you know those who were sentenced to 36 years won't be receiving any change to their sentence. It's been very hard. My husband has been in prison for 12 years and has 24 more years to go.
The tragic story of false imprisonment of evangelical Christians in Mexico later on the Persecution Report. But first, these stories. Another underground church leader has been murdered in Somalia. 41-year-old Muhammad Ahmed Ali was shot and killed on the outskirts of Mogadishu by members of the militant Islamic group Al-Shabaab. Muhammad and his wife Amina Ibrahim Hassin were reportedly being monitored by the militants for signs they had left Islam. The militants killed Muhammad, who became a follower of Christ in 2000 for his Christian activities. 2 days after her husband was murdered, Amina received a threatening phone call from the militants who stated, "We also know you're home and that you are a follower of the Christians, and we're going to kill you the same way we killed your husband." The next day, Amina set out for Kenya on a bus with a 2-year-old son. They safely arrived in Nairobi less than 3 weeks after her husband's death. A member of a Rhema church in Asmara, Eritrea, has died of a heart attack at Eritrea's Alla military camp. 41-year-old Hannah Hagos Asgundam had been detained at the Wea military camp for 3 years following her arrest in 2007 in the East African country. Hannah was moved to the Alla military camp when the Wea camp was dismantled last summer. On arrival at the new camp, Hannah was offered a final opportunity to renounce her faith. When she refused, she was placed in solitary confinement. Shortly before her death, she reportedly endured beatings with iron rods for refusing to make the chief commander in the camp a cup of coffee, an order local Christians believe was really a sexual advance. She was then returned to her cell and endured further punishment and eventually passed away. Uzbek Christians from the Baptist Council of Churches, a denomination that refuses to register with the state, have faced arrests and physical abuse in recent months. And here's another example. 28-year-old Tohar Hyderov was arrested in Sardavia region on charges of producing or storing drugs, charges that local Christians insist are fabricated. At the police station, Tohar was reportedly pressured and threatened to renounce his faith. When he refused, police allegedly planted drugs on him and also at his apartment with no witnesses present. At a court date 3 days after his arrest, Tohar told believers that police had beaten him and forced him to sign papers. His face was swollen and he could barely walk. He faces up to 20 years in prison. Uzbek Christians have been fined, beaten, and imprisoned for their faith, and others, like these men, meet in secret. A group of 48 Christians were forced from their homes in Katin village in Saravan province in Laos by approximately 100 officials and villagers. The believers who had gathered for Sunday worship were expelled from their church at gunpoint and brought to an open field. Officials then confiscated personal belongings from 11 Christian homes. 6 of the homes were later destroyed. A pig worth the equivalent of 6 weeks' salary was also seized from one of the believers. When the believers refused to renounce their faith, they were forced to walk 6 kilometers outside the village and were left at the side of the road. Officials have posted police at the entrance of the village to prevent the Christians from returning home or retrieving their valuables. The believers were forced to sleep on the ground in the woods with barely any food or survival supplies. We now travel to the southern Mexican state of Chiapas, where many of these women have been separated from their husbands for more than a dozen years. Some of these children have never met their fathers or grandfathers, and others were too young to remember the men when they were taken to prison on false charges of participating in a massacre in which 45 people were killed in the town of Acteal in Chiapas State. 34-year-old Estela Luna Perez is the spokesman for the families of the prisoners. Estela's father was one of 56 men, mostly evangelicals, who was in prison when we visited. She explains what sparked the December 22, 1997 massacre.
This all started when the Zapatistas took control here in Chiapas. They tried to get the other indigenous to be a part of their movement, and tried to do it by force. They promised lots of property and that one day we would be rich, but it wasn't true. The situation progressed to the point where the Zapatistas tried to take a piece of land where they had taken out gravel and was owned by some evangelicals and others who weren't involved with the Zapatistas. This is one of the things that ignited the violence here.
Estela says the Zapatistas became more and more violent, and they assaulted and killed more than 20 people who refused to join them. A group of men from neighboring villages went looking for the assailants who had taken their land. While they were looking for them, they came upon some supporters of the Zapatistas and violence broke out. By the time it was over, 45 people had been killed.
Those who did that had family members who were killed. 5 of the men who did this confessed after a few months and went to prison, and orders were put out to arrest the other 5. Those 10 involved confessed, but the government ignored those confessions.
The massacre drew international attention, and thousands of government investigators and federal police swarmed into the area.
Our people were just going about their business because they were innocent. My father and the others were rounded up and put in these big trucks and taken away. They were trusting because they didn't do anything wrong. My uncle told me my father had been arrested. And I said, they're simple, innocent people. They didn't know what was going on.
Over 100 men from 7 different communities were originally arrested. Almost half of them, Evangelical Christians, were charged with participating in the massacre, and some were sentenced up to 36 years in prison and convicted on evidence that 12 years later would be ruled as manufactured and unreliable. Area evangelicals believe the imprisoned believers were caught between survivors clamoring for convictions and government police and military forces eager to shift the blame away from themselves. An appeals court in Mexico overturned the convictions of more than 24 men in 2009 who were accused of carrying out the killings.
We had so many evangelical brothers in prison for years. Now the Supreme Court in Mexico has recognized that they were accused and sentenced based on manufactured evidence that was motivated by economics, religious, and political.
Marino, one of the released Acteal prisoners, wants justice for those still imprisoned. Marta Gomez has had a difficult and tragic life. Not only have 2 of her 3 children died, but her husband has been serving a 36-year sentence following the Acteal massacre. Marta says her husband, an evangelical Christian, was a government official in Chinelo. He had been sent out 2 days after the massacre by the head of his municipality, who had orders from the army and federal government to pick up and supposedly talk with leaders from the surrounding communities where the killings took place.
My husband ended up in this big truck with all the other leaders who were picked up. Those men in the end were accused and sentenced. I went back to the president of the community and said, I told you not to send my husband because they would involve him in this. He is from here and he wasn't involved in it. He was beaten, abused, and arrived naked.
Marta's husband, like the others arrested in 1997, don't speak Spanish and didn't realize what was happening to them and how manufactured evidence would be used to convict them. It was a travesty of justice right from the start.
It's discouraging when you know those who were sentenced to 36 years won't be receiving any change to their sentence. It's been very hard. My husband has been in prison for 12 years and has 24 more years to go.
That report from Acteal is included in the video Mexican Voices, Testimonies of the Persecuted, which will be released in April. You'll find out why evangelical Christians are being persecuted not only in Chiapas, but several other Mexican states. You'll also hear of their amazing faith in the midst of persecution. I know you will be inspired. Well, thanks for watching the Persecution Report. Remember, when one part of the body suffers, we all suffer. Goodbye, and God bless.
For more information on the ministry of the Voice of the Martyrs and ways in which you can help a persecuted church, please visit our website at persecution.net. That's persecution.net.